This is a story about a woman who was treated like a line item in a ledger, a convenient asset to be liquidated in a time of crisis. It's about the gilded cage she was born into, and the dusty, windswept freedom she had to build for herself, nail by painstaking nail. It's about the quiet, broken man who offered her a chance, not out of romance, but out of a shared understanding of what it felt like to be dispossessed. When Eleanor Vance stepped off that train in dusty Redemption, Montana, covered from head to toe in a thick traveler's veil, the town saw a mystery. A grieving widow, perhaps. A woman with a past to hide. Only one man standing on that platform knew the truth. He knew the name she was born with, the fortune she'd walked away from, and the precise, cutting cruelty that had put her on that train in the first place. He was the reason she was there, and he was already half convinced he'd made a terrible mistake. But he'd made a promise, and Caleb Blackwood was the kind of man who kept his promises, even the ones that threatened to ruin him. If you believe that a person's value isn't determined by their father's bank account or the advantageous marriage they can make, then stay with me. You're going to want to see how this ends. This is her story. The humiliation, when it came, was delivered in the polished mahogany chill of her father's Boston study. The air smelled of old leather and older money, a scent Eleanor had once found comforting and now found suffocating. She stood before his desk, her hands clasped, a portrait of docile obedience she did not feel. Her father, a man whose love was measured in quarterly reports and successful acquisitions, did not ask her to sit. Beside him, holding a crystal glass of brandy, stood Mr. Alistair Sterling. He was handsome in the way a marble statue is handsome, perfectly formed, elegantly presented, and utterly cold. He was to be her husband. This was the first she was hearing of it. "Eleanor," her father began, his voice devoid of warmth, "Mr. Sterling has done us a great honor. He has asked for your hand in marriage." He said it like he was announcing the successful merger of two competing shipping lines. Eleanor's throat went dry. She looked from her father's impassive face to Sterling's smug, proprietary smile. I don't understand. We've only met twice at social functions." Sterling took a slow sip of his brandy. "Your father and I have a long and fruitful business relationship, my dear. We both agree this union would be beneficial. It would solidify our family's interests." He said the word interests as if it explained everything, as if it replaced the need for affection or respect or even simple acquaintance. It was the word a banker used, and that's what this was. A transaction. A closing. Her father cleared his throat, the sound like gravel grinding. "There have been some unfortunate turns in the market, Eleanor. A few investments did not mature as expected. The Sterling family has been gracious enough to extend a line of credit that will see us through this temporary difficulty. Your marriage will be the seal on that arrangement." That was it then. She wasn't a bride. She was collateral. The sudden, searing shame of it was a physical blow. All her years of education, her fluency in French, her passion for literature and botany, all of it was meaningless. Her only value was as a token to be exchanged for debt forgiveness. She tried, one last time, to assert herself, a flicker of the person she thought she was. "Father, I had hoped to perhaps take a teaching position at the ladies' college." Sterling laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was worse. It was dismissive, a soft, patronizing chuckle that told her she was a silly, naive child. "My dear Eleanor, the wife of Alistair Sterling will not have hobbies that take her out of the home. Your duties will be to manage my household, host my associates, and in time, produce a suitable heir. Your education will be useful in ensuring our invitations are grammatically correct. Nothing more. He looked her up and down, a slow, appraising gaze that made her feel like livestock at auction. You have good breeding. That is what matters. Her father nodded in agreement. You will do your duty to this family, Eleanor. The matter is settled. She was dismissed, not with a wave, but with the finality of their tone. She turned, her back straight, her chin high, and walked out of the study, the door clicking shut behind her like the lock on a cell. In the dim hallway, waiting for his own appointment with her father, sat a man she didn't know. He was out of place in the opulent hall, his clothes sturdy but worn, his hands calloused, his face weathered by sun and wind. He looked up as she passed, and for a brief, searing moment, their eyes met. She saw not pity, but a flicker of grim understanding. He had heard. Of course he had. The door had been ajar. He had heard every single word of her utter and complete devaluation. The man in the hall was Caleb Blackwood, and his meeting with her father went just as poorly as hers had. Only his concerned cattle futures and water rights, not a life sentence. Mr. Vance was in no mood for renegotiation. The note on Caleb's Montana ranch was due, and Vance intended to collect one way or another. Caleb left the mansion with the weight of impending ruin settling on his shoulders, the same weight he'd seen in Eleanor Vance's eyes. He found her later, by accident. He was walking the perimeter of the manicured grounds, trying to clear his head before the long train ride back to a life that might soon not be his, and saw her in the rose garden. She was standing perfectly still, her gloved hands clenched at her sides, staring at a stone birdbath as if she could will it to crack. He knew he should walk away. This was not his business. He was a stranger, a debtor, a man with enough troubles to fill a canyon. But he remembered the cold finality in her father's voice, the dismissive cruelty in Sterling's. He'd seen men break wild horses with more kindness. He approached slowly, his boots scuffing on the gravel path. She didn't startle. It was as if she'd been expecting an executioner and was untroubled by the appearance of a simple rancher. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough. He stopped a respectful distance away. "I was in the hall. The door wasn't shut proper. I heard." She finally turned to him, her face a pale, composed mask that couldn't quite hide the storm in her eyes. "Then you heard that I am to be congratulated." The bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. He ignored it. "I heard a business deal. Seemed a poor one. From your end of it." For the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed her face. Surprise. "There is no other end of it, Mr. Blackwood, Caleb Blackwood." He took a breath. The words that came out next surprised him as much as they would her. They were unplanned, a reckless impulse born of a deep, abiding hatred for bullies. "I have a ranch in Montana. It's not Boston. It's mostly dust and hard work. My foreman, Gus. He's a good man with a horse but can't make sense of a ledger to save his life. I need a bookkeeper, someone who can manage the accounts, handle the payroll, write letters to suppliers." He laid it out plainly, with no embellishment. "It pays a wage, $30 a month, plus your keep. There's a small cabin you can have. It's clean, it's dry, and the door locks from the inside. No one will bother you." He watched her face, saw the confusion warring with a desperate, burgeoning hope. He had to make it clear. "This ain't a proposal, ma'am. It's a job offer. A way out if you want one. But I won't lie to you, It's a hard life. The winters will freeze the marrow in your bones. There's snakes and wolves and men who haven't seen a decent woman in a year. You'll be lonely. You'll be worked to exhaustion. But the work is honest, and your life will be your own. It was the most ridiculous, impulsive thing he had ever done. He was offering a lifeline to a drowning woman when his own boat was taking on water. But he had seen her trapped, and something in him, something he thought had died with his wife and son, refused to just walk away. Eleanor stared at him, this blunt, weathered stranger offering her, not a rescue, but a choice, a choice. It was a thing she hadn't realized she'd lost until this very moment. A prison of silk and pearls, or a harsh, brutal, beautiful freedom. "When would I have to leave?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Train leaves at dawn, day after tomorrow," Caleb said. "Be at the North Station. Ask for a ticket to Redemption, Montana, under the name of Mrs. Gray. A widow. It'll cause less talk." He tipped his hat. "The choice is yours, ma'am." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the dying light of the garden, the scent of roses mixing with the impossible promise of escape. The journey west was a long, rattling blur of clattering steel and endless plains. Eleanor wore the veil Caleb had suggested, a thick, black shroud that hid her face and her identity. It made her an object of quiet speculation, a woman of sorrows, and in a way, she was. She was mourning a life she'd never really lived, and the girl she had been forced to leave behind in Boston. Redemption, Montana, was less a town and more a suggestion of one. A single dusty street carved out of the vast, unforgiving landscape. The sky was immense, a piercing blue that seemed to go on forever, and the mountains on the horizon looked like jagged teeth. Caleb was there on the platform, as promised. He didn't smile, just nodded and took her single, heavy bag. "Ma'am," was all he said. The ranch was another hour's ride out of town. It was beautiful and brutal all at once. A collection of sturdy log buildings nestled in a valley carved by a fast-running creek. The small cabin was exactly that. One room, a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, a table, and a chair. It was stark, but it was hers. The air smelled of pine and horses and clean, cold water. Her proving ground began immediately. She was introduced to Gus, the foreman, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard years and whose skepticism was a palpable force. He looked at her soft hands and fine wool traveling suit and grunted, "A bookkeeper? From Boston?" The question hung in the air, thick with doubt. She ignored it. "If you'll show me the ledgers, mister." "It's just Gus." He led her to a small, cluttered office off the main barn and dumped a chaotic pile of receipts, notebooks, and loose papers onto a desk. "There's your accounts." It was a test. A mess designed to overwhelm her. For 2 days, Eleanor did not emerge except for meals. She worked by lantern light. Her mind, so long stifled by needlepoint and poetry, finally engaged in a problem it could solve. She sorted, cross-referenced, and calculated. The numbers told a story of hard work undercut by poor planning and missed opportunities. On the 3rd day, she walked into the main house and laid 3 neatly organized ledgers on Caleb's kitchen table. "You're overpaying for winter feed from the supplier in Miles City by nearly 15%, she said, her voice clear and steady. "And you're losing at least 5% of your profit margin by not accounting for lost stock during the spring thaw. I've drafted a new inventory system and a letter to a different feed supplier in Bozeman." Caleb picked up the ledger. He ran a calloused thumb over her neat, precise handwriting. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise and a grudging respect. Gus, who had been listening from the doorway, just grunted again, but this time it sounded different, less dismissive. The second test came a month later, on a bitter autumn night with a wind that howled like a hungry wolf. A prize mare, one of Caleb's best, was in labor and in trouble. The foal was breeched. Gus and Caleb were working frantically but losing ground. The mare was weakening. "Vet's 6 hours away, if he can even get through this wind," Gus said, his voice grim. Eleanor, drawn by the commotion, stood in the lantern-lit doorway of the barn. Her heart pounded, but her mind was clear. She remembered a book from her father's library, a volume on animal husbandry she'd read out of sheer boredom one summer. "You have to turn the foal," she said, stepping into the barn. Both men turned to stare at her. "What's that, Missy?" Gus asked. "The foal. You have to reach in and turn it. One of its forelegs is caught back." She described the procedure from the book, her voice calm and authoritative, relaying details she hadn't known she'd remembered. Gus looked at Caleb, who just stared at Eleanor for a long, silent moment. Then he nodded. "Do what she says." Under her clear, concise instructions, they worked together, a strange trinity of a Boston lady, a grizzled foreman, and a broken rancher. An hour later, a wet, shivering foal lay steaming in the hay at its mother's side. Gus finally looked at her, truly looked at her, and wiped the sweat from his brow. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. It was the highest praise she had ever received. In that moment, working side by side, covered in sweat and grime, she wasn't Eleanor Vance, the banker's daughter. She wasn't even Mrs. Gray, the mysterious widow. She was just Ellen, the woman who knew how to save the horse. And it was the first time in her life she had ever felt truly essential. The seasons turned. The brutal winter Eleanor had been warned about descended on the valley, burying the world in a silent blanket of white. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the deep, satisfying exhaustion that came from a day of physical work. She learned to bake bread in the cast-iron stove, to mend Caleb's shirts with neat, practical stitches, and to ride a steady-footed mare named Juniper across the frozen pastures. The woman who had once debated French philosophy in Boston drawing rooms now debated the price of salt licks at the general store in Redemption. She was becoming a different person, someone harder and more resilient, someone she was beginning to like. Her relationship with Caleb remained one of quiet, professional distance, but a thread of reliance had been woven between them. He depended on her sharp mind to keep the ranch solvent. She depended on his quiet strength to keep her world from collapsing. It was a partnership forged in shared labor, not affection. They spoke of cattle prices and weather fronts, never of Boston or the ghosts that haunted his past. The fragile peace was shattered on a deceptively mild day in early spring. The mail wagon brought a passenger, a man dressed in a fine wool coat and polished leather boots that were entirely unsuited for the muddy streets of Redemption. It was Alistair Sterling. Eleanor saw him from the window of the general store, and her blood ran cold. He had found her. The confrontation was inevitable, and it came, as she knew it would, in public. He cornered her near the feed sacks, his presence sucking all the air out of the room. The usual chatter of the store died down as everyone turned to watch. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low, furious hiss, "this absurd little adventure is over. Your father is beside himself with worry. You have caused a considerable scandal." He made it sound as if she'd spilled tea on a prize rug. "My name," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. Is Ellen Gray? Sterling's smile was a cruel, thin line. We can play at games later. You will pack your things. We are returning to Boston. He reached for her arm, and she flinched away. I am not going anywhere with you. Just then, the door creaked open and Caleb walked in. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. Sterling's fury, Eleanor's defiance, the avid curiosity of the onlookers. He moved to stand beside her, not touching her, but his presence was a bulwark. Sterling's gaze shifted to Caleb, his eyes filled with contempt. Blackwood, I should have known. You're the one who filled her head with this nonsense. Did you think you could hide her from me? He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. I know all about the debt you owe her father. A single word from me, and he will call in your note. You'll be ruined. Your ranch, this pathetic little life you've built, will be gone by summer. Now step aside. This was the moment. The public reckoning. All of redemption was watching. Eleanor felt a surge of adrenaline, a clarity she had never known. She was not a piece of property to be fought over. She stepped in front of Caleb, placing herself directly in Sterling's path. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the silent store. The engagement between us is over, Alistair. It was never an engagement. It was a business contract, and I am voiding it. He stared at her, genuinely shocked by her audacity. You have nothing, he sneered. You are nothing without your family's name. You're wrong, she said, and she felt the truth of it deep in her bones. I have a job, I have a home, and I have a choice. She turned her back on him, a final, complete dismissal, and looked at Caleb. We have work to do. She walked out of the store, Caleb right behind her, leaving Sterling standing alone amidst the sacks of flour and barrels of nails, his power utterly useless in this new world she had claimed as her own. The victory in the general store was short-lived. Sterling's threat lingered in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. He had left town that same day, but Eleanor knew a man like him would not accept defeat. He would use the weapon he had, the one thing Caleb couldn't fight: her father's money. The ranch, which had become her sanctuary, now felt terribly vulnerable. A few nights later, a late spring storm rolled down from the mountains, rattling the windows of her small cabin. Unable to sleep, she pulled on a heavy coat and made her way to the barn, knowing Caleb would be there, checking on the livestock. She found him in the dim lantern light, his back to her, running a gentle hand down the nose of the foal she had helped deliver. He seemed more withdrawn than usual, the familiar walls around him built up thicker and higher. Caleb? He turned, his face shadowed and grim. You should be inside. It's a bad one. I wanted to thank you, she said, moving closer. For what you did in the store, for standing with me. He shrugged, turning back to the horses. Didn't do anything. It was your fight. You fought it. His clipped response was meant to end the conversation, but she wouldn't let it. Why did you do it? She pressed, her voice soft but insistent. Why did you make me that offer in Boston? You didn't know me. You had your own troubles. He was silent for a long time. The only sounds, the wind and the soft munching of hay. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw, scraped clean of its usual gruffness. My wife, Sarah, he began, staring at a fixed point in the darkness. She died 3 years ago. Her and my boy, Daniel. Diphtheria. It came on fast. The dock was a day's ride away, and a blizzard had closed the pass. By the time it cleared, it was too late. The story came out in broken pieces, shards of a pain he had clearly never spoken of aloud. He blamed himself. He had brought them out here, to this beautiful, dangerous place that had ultimately taken them from him. He confessed that Sarah had been a lot like her. A teacher from back east, smart and stubborn, with hands that weren't made for ranch work, but learned it anyway because she refused to be beaten by it. She hated it here at first, he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Said the sky was too big and the silence was too loud. But she made it her own. She planted that garden you found behind your cabin, taught the local kids how to read. He finally turned to look at her, and in the flickering light, she saw the profound, unending grief in his eyes. That day, in your father's house, when I saw you standing there, with that look on your face, you looked just like she did. The day her own father told her she was a fool for wanting to marry a dirt-poor rancher and move west. The same fire, the same refusal to be broken. I couldn't save Sarah, or my boy. His voice cracked. But I looked at you, and I thought, maybe I could do something. Maybe I could open one damn cage. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something deeper, a confession of shared spirit, an acknowledgement of her strength. He had seen her, truly seen her, in a way no one else ever had. Eleanor reached out, her hand resting tentatively on his arm. The touch was electric, a current of understanding passing between them. The walls he had built around his heart didn't crumble, but for the first time, he had opened the gate. The letter arrived a week later. It was from her father's bank in Boston, formal and ruthless. As threatened, Alistair Sterling had spoken to her father. The full balance of Caleb's loan was being called in. He had 30 days to produce the entire amount, an impossible sum, or the bank would initiate foreclosure proceedings. The paper felt like a death warrant in Eleanor's hands. This was her fault. Her defiance in the general store had doomed the very man who had offered her a refuge, the place where she had painstakingly built a new life. Guilt was a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. She carried the letter to the main house and found Caleb by the fireplace, mending a bridle. She handed it to him without a word. He read it, his face betraying no emotion, then slowly folded it and placed it on the mantelpiece. He stared into the fire, his jaw tight. This was the crisis. Her choice had brought them to ruin. She saw the two paths laid out before her with brutal clarity. She could surrender. She could write to her father, agree to marry Sterling, and in exchange for her compliance, the debt would be forgiven. Caleb would keep his ranch. She would return to the silk-lined prison, but he would be safe. It was the path of respectable sacrifice. The other path was to stay, to fight alongside him for a home that would almost certainly be ripped away from them. It was the path of authenticity, and it led directly off a cliff. "I can fix this," she said, her voice strained. "I can go back. I will write to my father. I will tell him I will do what he asks." Caleb turned from the fire, his eyes blazing with an intensity she had never seen before. "No." The word was flat. Absolute. "You will not." "But it's the only way. He'll lose everything because of me." "This ranch," Caleb said, stepping toward her, his voice low and fierce, "is just land and lumber. I built it once, I can build it again. But it ain't worth that. It ain't worth you going back into that cage." In that moment, his own arc was complete. He was no longer just the reluctant caretaker. He was a man willing to lose everything he had ever built to protect her freedom. He was choosing her over his legacy, over his past. His declaration settled something deep inside her. It extinguished the guilt and ignited a burning resolve. She would not be his sacrifice, and he would not be hers. She lifted her chin, meeting his fiery gaze with her own. "Then we don't let them take it," she said. "We fight." A frantic energy seized her. She went to the desk where she kept the ledgers, her mind racing. There has to be a way, another source of income. Her fingers flew across the pages, tracing columns of figures, her mind connecting disparate pieces of information. "The army contract," she said, looking up at him, her eyes bright with a desperate, brilliant idea. "The government contract to supply beef to Fort Shaw. It's a huge order, more than we could handle alone. But the payment is immediate. If we could get that contract, if we could pull off the drive in time." It was a wild gamble. A massive cattle drive, organized in less than a month, with no capital for extra supplies or riders. It was impossible. It was their only hope. "All right," Caleb said, a slow, determined smile spreading across his face for the first time. "Let's go fight." The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. To fulfill the army contract, they would need to drive nearly 500 head of cattle over 100 miles of rough country, and they needed to do it in under 3 weeks. It required more riders, more horses, and more supplies than Caleb had. And it all required money, which they did not have. Their first stop was the Bank in Redemption, a small local institution run by a cautious man named Mr. Harris. Eleanor had prepared a detailed proposal, complete with projected costs and profit margins. But Harris shook his head. "It's too big a risk, Caleb. With the First Boston Bank holding a foreclosure notice over your head, I can't extend that kind of credit." They left the bank defeated, the weight of the impossible pressing down on them. That evening, the town was holding its annual harvest dance in the Grange Hall. The idea of attending felt absurd, but Gus insisted. "You gotta go," the old foreman said, his expression unusually serious. "You can't look like you're beaten. You and the missus, you gotta walk in there with your heads held high. Let folks see you're still in the fight." He called her the missus. It was the first time. Walking into the Grange Hall felt like walking onto a stage. The music stopped for a half-second as all eyes turned to them. The whispers started immediately. Everyone knew about Sterling's visit. Everyone had heard the rumors of foreclosure. They saw Eleanor not as the capable woman who had become part of their community, but as the source of Caleb Blackwood's troubles, the fancy Eastern woman who had brought ruin to his door. They stood awkwardly by the entrance, a pariah and her keeper. Then, Caleb did something that stunned the entire room. He, who never socialized, who hadn't been seen at a town dance since before his wife died, straightened his shoulders and walked directly across the floor to her. He stopped in front of her, ignoring the stares and the whispers, and held out his calloused hand. "Mrs. Gray," he said, his voice clear and steady enough for everyone to hear. "May I have this dance?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a public declaration. In front of the entire town, he was choosing her. He was showing them that she was not his liability. She was his partner. He was refusing to be ashamed. Her hand found his, and he led her to the center of the floor. The fiddler, recovering from his shock, struck up a slow waltz. They were clumsy at first. He was a man more comfortable on a horse than a dance floor, and she was accustomed to the polished ballrooms of Boston. But they found their rhythm. He held her firmly, respectfully, his hand a warm, solid presence on her back. In the circle of his arms, with the whole town watching, the shame and fear fell away. They were not outcasts. They were two people, standing together against the world. As the song ended, the spell was broken, but something had shifted. The quality of the stares had changed from suspicion to a grudging admiration. Later that evening, two local ranchers, men Caleb had known for years, approached them. "Blackwood," one of them said, tipping his hat to Eleanor. "Heard about your plan for the Fort Shaw Drive. It's a fool's errand." He paused. "But if any fool could pull it off, it's you. We've got a dozen good riders between us. They're yours if you need them. Pay us back when the army pays you." Another man joined them. "I've got 3 wagons and enough salt beef to see you through. Consider it a loan." One by one, the community they had faced down rallied around them. They saw not a scandal, but a fight for a home. And in Montana, there was nothing more sacred than that. The cattle drive was a blur of organized chaos, a river of dust and hooves flowing north. The work was relentless, from before sunrise until long after dark. Eleanor rode in the supply wagon, which she had converted into a mobile office. She was the quartermaster, the bookkeeper, and the paymaster, managing the logistics with the same precision she had applied to Caleb's ledgers. She was no longer a passenger in this life. She was a driving force. They faced every trial the Montana wilderness could throw at them. A sudden, terrifying thunderstorm that threatened a stampede, a treacherous river crossing that nearly cost them a wagon, and the constant, grinding exhaustion. Through it all, she and Caleb worked as a seamless unit, communicating with nods and glances, a partnership forged in the crucible of shared crisis. They reached Fort Shaw with a day to spare, the herd intact. The Army quartermaster, a man accustomed to dealing with rough-spoken cattle bosses, was taken aback when a woman in a dusty but practical split skirt presented him with a perfectly organized manifest and bill of lading. They were paid in full, a stack of crisp government notes that felt heavier and more valuable than all the gold in her father's vaults. The ride back to redemption was triumphant. They walked directly from the livery to the office of the bank representative handling the foreclosure. Caleb slapped the entire cash payment down on the man's desk. "The Blackwood account," he said, his voice flat. "Paid in full." The look on the agent's face, a mixture of shock and thwarted ambition, was a sweeter victory than Eleanor could have imagined. A year slid by. The ranch didn't just survive, it thrived. With the profits from the Army contract, they bought the adjacent parcel of land, expanded their herd, and built a new wing on the main house. Eleanor's sharp business sense, combined with Caleb's deep knowledge of the land, had turned the struggling ranch into one of the most successful operations in the valley. They were married in the autumn, not in the town church, but by the creek that ran through their land. Gus stood as Caleb's best man, and Billy, the young stable hand who now looked at Eleanor with open adoration, shyly gave her away. It was a small, quiet ceremony, witnessed by the family they had chosen under the vast Montana sky. One day, a letter with a Boston postmark arrived. It wasn't from her father, but from her younger sister. The news was stark. A series of disastrous investments had ruined their father. His health had failed. A stroke had left him diminished, a shadow of the powerful man he had been. Alistair Sterling, seeing no profit in a union with a bankrupt family, had promptly broken the engagement and married a railroad heiress. Her father, her sister wrote, was asking for her. He wanted to see her. Eleanor read the letter, then walked out to the porch and looked at the mountains. She felt a surprising lack of triumph, and an even more surprising lack of anger. There was only a quiet sadness for the man who had never known her, and who had never understood the meaning of true wealth. She wrote back that afternoon. She told her sister she forgave him. She wished him peace. But her life, her home, her family, they were here. The forgiveness was for herself, a way of closing a door on a past that no longer had any power over her. Another year passed, then another. The ranch was a living, breathing thing, a testament to their shared work. Eleanor was sitting on the expanded porch, a mending basket in her lap, though she wasn't mending. Her hands rested on the gentle swell of her belly. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, painting the hills in strokes of gold and purple. Caleb came and sat beside her in the rocking chair he'd built, his familiar silence as comfortable as a warm blanket. He reached over and placed his large, calloused hand over hers on her stomach, and they watched the sky change color together. She thought back to the woman who had stepped off the train in this town, shrouded in a veil and a fictional identity. Mrs. Gray. A name chosen for protection, a shield against a world that saw her as a runaway. She had been so fragile then, so certain she was broken. She looked down at her own hands. They were not the hands of Eleanor Vance, the Boston socialite. They were not soft or pale. They were tanned by the sun, with calluses on the palms from reins and rope, and a faint scar on one knuckle from a misplaced hammer. These were the hands of Ellen Blackwood. They were hands that had balanced ledgers, delivered a foal, held a pen to sign a contract, and gripped the reins of a horse on a 100-mile cattle drive. They were the hands of a woman who had built a life. Her father had believed her worth was something to be bestowed, a matter of bloodline and connection, a commodity to be traded for financial security. Mr. Sterling had believed her worth lay in her appearance and her ability to produce an heir. They were both wrong. Her worth had never been in a name or a dowry. It wasn't something that could be given to her or taken away. It was something she had to forge herself, in the dust and the heat and the cold, through work and courage and the stubborn, unrelenting refusal to be anything less than who she was meant to be. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb's voice was a low rumble beside her. She turned and smiled at him, a real, unburdened smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "I was just thinking," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him, the quiet certainty of their life together. This is what freedom feels like. And it was. It was the vast, open sky, the smell of pine on the evening air, and the steady, beating heart of the man beside her. It was home.